Miss Hedges. Moravian College, October 22nd, 2013.
Portrait of the American character and our ultimate fate as a species is found in Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Melville, in his novel, makes our murderous obsessions, blinding hubris, violent impulses, moral cowardice, and lust for self-destruction visible in his chronicle of a doomed whale. Ends on the Federal Reserve to purchase $85 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds, much of it worthless subprime mortgages, each month survive. Corporate masters lavishly provide across the political and cultural spectrum to keep us passive. Friedrich Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil, wrote that only a few people have the fortitude to look into what he calls the molten pit of human reality. A handful of artists and philosophers, for Nietzsche, are consumed by an insatiable curiosity, a quest for truth, a desire for meaning, and this sends them down into the bowels of the pit. They get as close as they can before the flames and heat drive them back. This understanding, Nietzsche wrote, comes at a high cost. Those singed by the fire become burnt children, eternal orphans in empires of illusion. Us to peer into the pit or heed the cries of those who have seen what awaits us. The corporate state rather feeds the thirst for illusion, happiness, and hope. It peddles the fantasy of endless material progress. It insists, and this is the argument of globalization, that our voyage is unalterable, decreed by natural law. It is part of the march of human progress, and those who challenge this myth are heretics. It comes from accepting that catastrophic climate change is virtually certain. This obliteration of false hopes, he says, requires an intellectual knowledge and an emotional knowledge. The first is attainable. The second, because it means those we love, including our children, will face insecurity, misery, and suffering within a few decades, if not a few years, is much harder to acquire. To emotionally accept impending disaster, to attain the gut-level understanding that the power elite will not respond rationally to collapse, is as difficult to accept as our own mortality, has been on a 500-year-long planet-wide rampage of conquering, plundering, looting, exploiting, and polluting the earth, as well as killing the indigenous communities that stood in the way. But the game is up. The technological and scientific forces that created a life of unparalleled luxury as well as unrivaled military and economic power for a small global elite are the forces that now, after the hottest year in the contiguous 48 states since record-keeping began 107 years ago, we lack the vision and the courage to shut down the engines of global capitalism. Complex civilizations, as many anthropologists have observed, have a habit of ultimately destroying themselves. Joseph Tainter, in The Collapse of Complex Societies, Charles Redmond, in Human Impact on Ancient Environments, and Ronald Wright, in A Short History of Progress, have laid out the familiar patterns that lead to systems breakdown. The difference is that when we go down this time, the whole planet will go with us. There will, with this final collapse, be no new lands to exploit, no new civilizations to conquer, no new peoples to subjugate, no new resources to plan. Not long after they reach their period of greatest power and prosperity. One of the most pathetic aspects of human history is that every civilization expresses itself most pretentiously, compounds its partial and universal values most convincingly, and claims immortality for its finite existence at the very moment when the decay which leads to death has already begun, Reinhold Niebuhr wrote. Ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, even Easter Island were destroyed by the mechanisms that once made them prosper. The novel ways these civilizations found to exploit the environment such as the invention of irrigation systems, eventually created disastrous, unforeseen complications. Ronald Wright, in A Short History of Progress, calls this the progress trap. Felt in the face of ecological and economic chaos will unleash further collective delusions, a belief, for example, that God or gods will come back to earth and save us. The Christian right embodies the escapism of crisis cults. These cults will perform absurd rituals, in our case probably Christian, to make it all go away. Believers will be entranced by magical thinking. Words, politicians, television personalities, and generals hold up seductive images of unrivaled wealth and power. Like Ahab and his crew, these images spur us towards self-annihilation. All my means are same, Ahab says, my motive and my object mad. Melville, who had been a sailor on clipper ships and whalers, was aware that the wealth of industrialized societies was violently seized from the wretched of the earth. All the authority figures on the ship are white men: Ahab, Starbuck, Flask, and Stubb. The hard, dirty work from Harper, with the support of political parties, strike funds, and union halls. Workers without these support mechanisms had to replicate the infrastructure of parties and unions if they wanted to put prolonged pressure on the bosses and the state. But now, with the decimation of the U.S. manufacturing base, along with the dismantling of our unions and opposition parties, we will have to search for different instruments of rebellion. We will have to develop a revolutionary theory that is not reliant on the industrial or agrarian muscle of workers. Most manufacturing jobs have disappeared, and of those that remain, few are unionized. Our family farms have been destroyed by agribusinesses. Monsanto and its Faustian counterparts on Wall Street rule. They are steadily poisoning our lives and rendering us powerless. The corporate leviathan, which is global, is freed from the constraints of a single nation state or government. Revolutionary struggles in industrial societies in the past. Our revolt will look more like what erupted in less industrialized Slavic republics, Russia, Spain, and China, and uprisings led by disenfranchised rural and urban working class and peasantry in the liberation movements that swept through Africa and Latin America. The dispossessed working poor, along with unemployed college students and graduates, unemployed journalists, lawyers, and teachers, along with impoverished artists, will form our movement. And this is why the fight for a higher minimum wage is crucial to uniting service workers with the alienated college-educated sons and daughters of the declining middle class. Bakunin, unlike Marx, considered these déclassé intellectuals essential for successful revolt. Revolutions. It is those who conclude that they will not be able, as they once expected, to rise economically and socially. Service workers and fast food workers know they are trapped, as does the swelling population of college graduates caught in a vice of low-paying jobs and obscene amounts of debt. These two groups, once united, will be our primary engines of revolt. Impoverished urban centers, our internal colonies, as Malcolm X called them. Mobilization will be difficult. The urban poor are in chains, and those chains are being readied for the rest of us. Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan examine 100 years of violent and nonviolent resistant movements in their book, Why Civil Resistance Works. They concluded that nonviolent movements succeed twice as often as violent uprisings. Violent movements work primarily in civil wars or in ending foreign occupations, they found. Nonviolent movements appeal to those within the power structure, especially the police and civil servants, who are cognizant of the corruption and decadence of the power elite and are willing in the end to abandon them. And we need only 1 to 5% of the population actively working for the overthrow of a system, history has shown, to bring down even the most ruthless totalitarian structures, such as public banks, to free ourselves from the control, and finding mechanisms to halt the machine. The most important impediment facing us now is not ideological, it is logistical. The security and surveillance state has made its highest priority the breaking of any infrastructure that might spark widespread unrest or revolt. The state knows the tinder is there. It knows that the continued unraveling of the economy and the effects of climate change make popular unrest inevitable. It knows that as underemployment and unemployment doom at least a quarter of the U.S. population, perhaps more, to perpetual poverty, and as unemployment benefits are scaled back, as schools close, as the middle class withers away, as pension funds are looted by hedge fund thieves, and as the government continues to let the fossil fuel industry ravage the planet, the future will increasingly be one of infrastructure to sustain resistance. The state, in its internal projections, has a vision of the future that is as dystopian as mine. But the state, to protect itself, uses its mechanisms of propaganda to assure us that we can continue to build a society based on limitless growth, profligate consumption, and a dependence on fossil fuel. The mania for hope is fed at the expense of truth. The corporate state, meanwhile, is preparing secretly for the world it knows is actually coming. It is cementing into place a pervasive police state, one that includes the complete evisceration of our most basic civil liberties and the militarization of the internal security apparatus, as well as the wholesale surveillance of the citizenry. These were the forces that, as Ralph Ellison wrote, we had in place of freedom. The oppressed would be the first, for they often know their fate, to admit that on a rational level, such a notion is absurd. But they also know that it is only through the imagination that they survive. Jewish inmates in Auschwitz reportedly put God on trial for the Holocaust and then condemned God to death. This is a rational response to the horror of the Holocaust. A rabbi stood after the verdict to lead the evening prayers. This is the absurdity we must capture. African Americans and Native Americans, for centuries, had little control over their destinies. Forces of bigotry and violence kept them subjugated by whites. Suffering for the oppressed was tangible. Death was a constant companion. And it was only their imagination, as William Faulkner noted at the end of The Sound and the Fury, that permitted them, unlike the novel's white Compson family, to endure. The theologian James Cone captures this in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Cone says that for oppressed blacks, the cross on which Jesus was crucified was a paradoxical religious symbol because it inverts the world's value system, with the news that hope comes by way of defeat, that suffering and death do not have the last word, that the last shall be first, and the first last. Cone continues, that God could make a way out of no way in Jesus' cross was truly absurd to the intellect, yet profoundly real in the souls of black folk, enslaved blacks who first heard the gospel message, seized on the power of the cross. Christ crucified manifests God's loving and liberating presence in the contradictions of black life, the transcendent presence in the lives of black Christians that empowered them to believe that ultimately, in God's eschatological future, they would not be defeated by the troubles. The third claim of faith was only possible in humility and repentance. There was no place for the proud and the mighty, for people who think that God called them to rule over others. The cross was God's critique of power, white power, with powerless love, snatching victory out of defeat. Reinhold Niebuhr labeled this capacity to defy forces of repression, even in the face of near certain defeat, a sublime madness in the soul. Niebuhr wrote that nothing but madness will do battle with malignant power, and spiritual wickedness in high places. This sublime madness, as Niebuhr understood, is vital. Without it, truth is obscure. And Niebuhr also knew that traditional liberalism was a useless force in moments of extremity. Liberalism, Niebuhr said, lacks the spirit of enthusiasm, not to say fanaticism, which is so necessary to move the world out of its beaten tracks. It is too intellectual and too little emotional to be an effective force in history. Or a scream in the night. While the world is at ease and asleep, the prophet feels the blast from heaven. The prophet, because he or she saw and faced an unpleasant reality, was, Heschel said, compelled to proclaim the very opposite of what his or her heart expected. Rebellion is a moral imperative. It is to be carried out regardless of the possibilities of success. It is not for the practical or the timid. It is an act that is performed in the end because in times of despair and suffering, it affirms life. Exchange for lessons in French. Levi recites to Samuel from memory Canto 26 of Dante's The Inferno. It is the story of Ulysses' final voyage. We cheered, but soon that cheering turned to woe. For then a whirlwind, born from the strange land, battered our little vessel on the prow. 3 times the boat and all the sea were whirled, and at the 4th, to please another's will, the aft tipped in the air, the prow went down until the ocean closed above our bones. Necessary and urgent that he listen, that he understand, before it is too late. Tomorrow he or I might be dead, or we might never see each other again. It is only those who find the courage to peer into the molten pit who can minister to the suffering of those around them. They will be infected with this sublime madness. As Hannah Arendt wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism, the only morally reliable people are not those who say, this is wrong, or this should not be done, but those who say, I can't. They know that, as Immanuel Kant wrote, if justice perishes, human life on earth has lost its meaning. And this means that, like Socrates, we must come to a place where it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong, no matter what happens around us. We can surmount despair, not by ignoring reality, but by responding radically to it. And this includes acts of civil disobedience, including jail time. In these acts, we become fully human. One of the only coherent philosophical positions is revolt, Camus wrote. It is a constant confrontation between man and his obscurity. It is not aspiration, for it is devoid of hope. That revolt is the certainty of a crushing fate without the resignation that ought to accompany it, said, in remembering the final days of the wars of Western expansion. He went on to say of the great Sioux warrior, he hardly ever stayed in the camp. People would find him out alone in the cold, and they would ask him to come home with them. He would not come, but sometimes he would tell the people what to do. People wondered if he ate anything at all. Once my father found him out alone like that, and he said to my father, Uncle, you have noticed me the way I act, but do not worry. There are caves and holes for me to live in, and out here the spirits may help me. I am making plans for the good of my people. Owens, Prospero, Anthony, Juliet, Rosalind, Hamlet, Cordelia have this sublime madness. King Lear, once he was stripped of power and forced to live with the persecuted and poor, had it. It was only then that he could see. It was only then that he understood that unbridled human lust and hubris led to the suicide of the Republicans fighting the fascists in Spain. Music, Dance, drama, art, song, painting were the fire and drive of all of history's resistance. Illuminate that darkness. Blaze roads through the vast forest, James Baldwin wrote, so that we will not, in all our doing, lose sight of its purpose, which is, after all, to make the world a more humane dwelling place. Ultimately, the artist and the revolutionary function as they function, and pay whatever dues they must pay behind it, because they are both possessed by a vision, that they do not so much follow this vision as find themselves driven by it, Baldwin wrote. But I know these corporate forces have us by the throat, and they have my children by the throat. I do not fight fascists because I will win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. And this is a fight which, in the face of the overwhelming forces arrayed against us, requires us to embrace sublime madness, to find in acts of rebellion the embers of life, an intrinsic meaning that lies outside the certainty of success. We must at once grasp our reality, and then refuse to allow reality to paralyze us. We must make an absurd leap of faith. We must believe, despite the empirical evidence around us, that the good always draws to it the good. We do not know where acts of goodness go. The Buddhists call it karma. But in these acts, we make visible a better world. It is time for our own mutiny, for the overthrow of our own Ahabs, for the redirecting of our ship away from certain death back towards life. No matter how bleak things get, we always have a choice in life. We can choose to be rebels or slaves, and that choice is one the corporate state is powerless to take from us. He spent most of his adult life in prison or in exile, knew something of despair. But he knew something too of resistance, of that rebellious spirit which must define us in times of oppression if we are to remain fully human. Any act of resistance, large or small, he wrote from inside his prison cell, is its own eternal triumph. Any act of resistance lights up the night sky to remind us why we were created. Hikmet captured this in his poem on living. Living is no laughing matter. You must live with great seriousness, like a squirrel, for example. I mean, without looking for something beyond and above living. I mean, living must be your whole occupation. Living is no laughing matter. You must take it seriously, so much so, and to such a degree that, for example, your hands tied behind your back to the wall, or else in a laboratory in your white coat and safety glasses, you can die for people, even for people whose faces you've never seen, even though you know living is the most real, the most beautiful thing. I mean, you must take living so seriously that even at 70, for example, you'll plant olive trees, and not for your children either, but because, although you fear death, you don't believe it, because living, I mean, weighs heavier. Let's say we're seriously ill, need surgery, which is to say we might not get up from the white table, even though it's impossible not to feel sad about going a little too soon. We'll still laugh at the jokes being told. We'll look out the window to see if it's raining, or still wait anxiously for the latest newscast. Let's say we're at the front for something worth fighting for, say. There, in the first offensive on that very day, we might fall on our face, dead. We'll know this with a curious anger, but we'll still worry ourselves to death about the outcome of the war, which could last years. Let's say we're in prison, and close to 50, and we have 18 more years, say, before the iron doors will open. We'll still live with the outside, with its people and animals, struggle and wind. I mean, with the outside beyond the walls. I mean, however and wherever we are, we must live as if we will never die. This earth will grow cold, a star among stars, and one of the smallest, a gilded mote on blue velvet. I mean this, our great earth. This earth will grow cold one day, not like a block of ice or a dead cloud even, but like an empty walnut. It will roll along in pitch black space. You must grieve for this right now. You have to feel this sorrow now. For the world must be loved this much if you're going to say, I live. Who has debt? Probably almost everybody in here would raise their hand. And it's not small debt. I mean, people are graduating from these schools with $60,000, $70,000 worth of debt. And they're being thrown into a job market, we know from the demographics, where at best, in most cases, they're going to be lucky to get minimum wage. Now, that's just kind of a debt peonage. And African Americans can tell you how debt peonage has long been a form of social control. So, one of my great concerns is that the student body has not mobilized. I don't know if you followed the whole reconfiguration of the student loan bill. In the short term, they're going to keep the interest rates, but in the long term, they're going to jack them up, higher than if you went to a bank to borrow it. And it's the cruelty of it, the fact that, you can declare bankruptcy, but it doesn't erase student debt. It just keeps accruing. I mean, this is just insane. And so you walk out of college having invested in your own education, and you're just crippled. And they want it that way. I lived in France. My son is now doing graduate work in Paris. And I said to him, if you told French university students that they had to pay $40,000 or $50,000 a year to go to university, they'd shut the damn country down. And you should shut the damn country down. Because you have a right to your education without walking out. The fact that you came to college, you worked hard, it's so wrong. When I went to college, I had no money, but I got money, if you can believe it, from the state. We had a program called TAP, we had Regents, I got lots of money. And all of those programs have been eviscerated. So you go to, I've taught at Princeton, you get a certain segment of the population, the rest are just the ultra-rich. So, I worry about, as a father, environmentally. We have totally betrayed you. And I think that as things unravel, you're going to look back at us, and you should, with a great deal of hatred. And say, what did you do? Not only you didn't do anything, you lied to us. I guess you made us feel good for the moment. And much of my own activism, and I've been arrested in the Occupy movement in front of Goldman Sachs and other places, is because I have kids. And so I fail. At least my kids will know I tried. And I worry about your generation. My oldest son is 23. I'm going to have kids your age. My daughter is a sophomore in college. I'm terrified. And I just am so angry at my generation for doing this to you. And for not being honest with you. It's bleak. Read climate change reports. I don't make them up. And it scares me. My littlest son, his favorite book is Out of the Blue. These are like pictures.